Romans chapter 11, that's where we're going to be at here in just a couple of moments. When I was a kid, I was constantly asking why. More than asking what or where or when or how, I wanted to know why. And when adults often answered me the way that adults often answered kids when they asked why, it drove me crazy. It frustrated me. When they would say something like, because I said so, or because that's the way we've always done it, or because that's just the way it is, or because that's the rule, I would always then want to know, why have we always done it this way? Why did you just say so? Why is that the rule? In Romans 11, Paul is explaining the purpose that God is giving behind the revival that's being experienced among the non-Gentile people. The Jews, for the large part, were rejecting Jesus and the message of the gospel. They had rejected Jesus, and now they were rejecting the church. And in both instances, when the chosen people of God rejected God, God used it to do a greater good. Because the Jews rejected Jesus, Jesus was crucified, and he died an unjust death of the crucifixion, satisfying the justice for our sins. So God used that rejection of his chosen people for the good of the entire world. Now, the Jews were rejecting the message of the gospel and the message of the church, and God was using that as well. When the church started in Jerusalem and the Jews in Jerusalem wanted nothing to do with it, they started to persecute the church. They saw it growing among a large group of people, but they wanted to push it out and they wanted to persecute them. When that happened, the people fled from Jerusalem. They became refugees, and when they did that, they carried the gospel with them to all these other places, and the gospel began to spread into cities like Rome, into cities like Ephesus. And so when Paul is writing to the Romans, he says, God is using the rejection of the church to spread the gospel message around the world. In verse 30, Paul points this out. For as in ye in times past have not believed God, yet have now obtained mercy through their unbelief. Then in verse 31, he says, God will use this then to reach the Jews. He says, now that the gospel has been pushed out and all of these people are believing in Christ, God's going to in turn use that to also reach the Jews. Verse 31 says, even so have these also now not believed, that through your mercy they may obtain mercy. You know what Paul's saying? Paul is saying, even in this circumstance, God knows what he's doing. Even in this difficult circumstance, God knows what he is doing. Even in the complicated, difficult question about the free will of man and the sovereignty of God, God is in the midst of evil doing good. He is there in the midst of what some meant for evil to do good in the world. And only God is wise enough to do good in bad circumstances. Only God is wise enough to use the very worst of circumstances to bring about the very best character in us. That's what he has done here. And Paul's heart is so overwhelmed that while he's writing about what God has done, that he just gets excited. In verses 33 to 36, are Paul, he's just kind of screaming out, man, God is incredible. Now, I'm sure that as Paul is writing about this, he's thought about his own personal life. He's thought about the fact that God has used bad to do good. You see, Paul was a part of that group in Jerusalem that rejected the message of Jesus and was persecuting the church. And as the people fled Jerusalem going out to all these cities, Paul said, we've got to go get them in those cities and arrest them there. And he was on his way to find more Christians to arrest when God intervened and used that situation where he's going to arrest Christians to convince him of the message of Jesus Christ. And God did an incredibly good thing in the middle of that horrible set of circumstances. God used the bad to bring about good. Now, I want you to just take a moment and think about a time that God's done exactly that in your life. That God has used a horrible set of circumstances to bring about good in your own heart and life. God has used something that perhaps you got yourself into because of your poor choices, your foolish decisions, your sin. God's used that to teach you an important lesson. God's used that to show you something about himself. Paul is overcome with gratitude when he thinks about the fact that God is using this bad set of circumstances to do good. That in God's wisdom, God is using something that seems unredeemable, like people rejecting the truth and persecuting the church. God is even using that to do his good work in the world. So Paul is overjoyed when he writes verses 33 to 36. Let's look at that together. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God! Exclamation point. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. For who hath known the mind of the Lord, or who hath been his counselor, or who hath first given to him, and it shall be recompensed unto him again? For of him and through him and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever. Amen. Paul says, how incredible is the wisdom and knowledge of God? How magnificent is God's wisdom that he is doing this thing in the world. You realize that the most brilliant of people still have areas of their life that they're not so bright in, that they struggle with. If I were to ask everyone in this room to name a famous genius, probably several people would name Albert Einstein. But you know that Albert Einstein, as brilliant as he was, that there were some things that he really struggled with. When he took the entrance exam to get into college, he failed it. He had to go to a trade school for a year, then come back and take the exam again, and this time he passed. He was not a good student. He eventually ended up dropping out of college to sell insurance, and he was really bad at selling insurance. He found his love for math when he got a job in the patent office. He had to work on these patents and constantly do math, and that is when he realized, man, maybe math is my thing. But even when he found his strong suit in math, he continued to struggle in other areas of his life. One of those areas was relationships. He had a couple of failed marriages. In one of his marriages, he proposed a contract with his wife that said something along the lines of, you will make sure that all of my clothes are clean and pressed and that my room is always at the ready, and you'll provide me 3 meals a day, and I will treat you with the utmost respect as I would treat any woman who is a stranger to me. I want you to think about how that contract went over. All right? That was the kind of thing that you would look at and you go, nice move, Einstein. As brilliant as he was, there was an area of his life that he really struggled in. And we all know people that, man, when it comes to this particular field, they are the top of their field. They are really smart when it comes to this particular thing, but in another area, they're not as strong. When we talk about the wisdom and knowledge of God, we're not talking about a God who is wise and all-knowing in the sense of religious and spiritual matters. We believe in a God who is omniscient, meaning he is all-knowing or all-understanding. He is universally known. Just as we believe that he is omnipotent or all-power, universally powerful, and omnipresent, everywhere, always present, universally present, we believe that he's omniscient, he is all-knowing, or he universally knows all. There is no field or subject that he struggles with. There is no field or subject where he says, well, I'm not really an expert when it comes to that. He knows all things. And when Paul is talking about the way that God has worked all of these things together, even in an evil situation and in bad circumstances to do good, he exclaims, God is deeper and richer in wisdom than we can know. God is deeper and richer in wisdom than we can know. And when Paul uses these words, depth and riches, he communicates what he has found to be true about God. Piper says that when he uses the word depth, it implies reality. That when he uses the word depth, it's not just, hey, God is just incredibly all-knowing and we can't really put our mind around it. We can't really grasp it. It's just out there. He's not peering into a black hole that is God's wisdom. No, he is talking about something he has experienced, but he knows goes far beyond the depth that he can comprehend. If you and I, we see a large tree, there is this large trunk of the tree and these large branches that you and I can see and we can appreciate, but we know for that large tree to stay upright, there must also be a large part of the tree that we cannot see. There are roots that go deep into the ground, and perhaps we can see 1 or 2 roots that are on the surface, but there is a series of roots deep in the ground that we cannot see until that tree perhaps is toppled over, and then we see this huge ball of roots that before we couldn't have appreciated. God's wisdom is like that. We can have it in our lives. We can experience the difference it makes in our lives, but it goes far beyond what we can experience, comprehend, or appreciate. It is that deep. While we can learn a lot about God's wisdom, we quickly recognize that it goes far beyond what we can grasp or understand. It's far beyond our comprehension or depth. This verse not only points out the fact that God's wisdom is deeper than we can see or appreciate, it points out to the fact that God's wisdom is foundational. There is no definition or explanation deeper than God. It's not that we dig down to the bottom where God's depth ends and that there is something else that God's wisdom is resting upon. There is nothing deeper and more foundational in the truth and facts of this life than God. He is deep and rich in knowledge and wisdom. Now, knowledge is knowing a fact. Wisdom is applying that knowledge in decision making. Knowledge is knowing what a hammer is. Wisdom is knowing when to use a hammer. And there's a big difference, right? We all know someone who could tell you that's a hammer, but we would not give it to them and let them swing it at our home. Because they might know what it is, but they don't have the wisdom to use it. Knowledge is knowing what a savings account is. Wisdom is actually putting money in it. Right? And a lot of us know what a savings account is, but we aren't exercising the wisdom to put anything in one. I want you to realize that God not only knows all truth, God always knows what to do. And man, there's a big difference there, isn't it? God not only knows all truth, God always knows what to do. I often know information, but don't know what to do with the information or how to apply it to my life. God knows all of the information, and He knows what to do with that information. My son will be 2 next month. He loves trucks. He loves trucks to the point that every time a truck goes by, he wants to run to the screen door and say, "Truck, big truck." When I come around the corner and he sees me, he'll point, he'll say, "Dad's truck." He recognizes trucks. If he's sitting in the car where he can see out the windows, anytime a truck drives by, he will say, "Truck." And it's cute once or twice, but it gets really old on a long trip. But while Lincoln knows what a truck is, I'm not giving him the keys to my truck anytime soon, because he's not ready to drive a truck. Because we can know something, but not be ready to use it. God not only knows all things, He always knows what to do. And that means that God not only knows how many hairs are on your head, He knows what should happen next in your life. He not only knows everything about your spouse, He knows the things that you should and should not say to her. He not only knows how many drops are in the ocean, He knows the things that you should be concerned about and care about. He not only knows the things that are going to happen in your schedule tomorrow, He knows how you should react to them. He knows all, and He always knows what to do. He is rich in depth of wisdom and knowledge. Now, God knows all because He's the source of all. When Paul says depth, he says depth of riches. And riches, it communicates that he owns it. He is rich in it because it belongs to him. If a banker thinks, "Man, I'm rich because all of these people have money in my bank," he's wrong, right? He is rich if there is a lot of money in his account, not if there's a lot of money in my account. He is rich when He owns it. And God is rich in wisdom because He owns wisdom. And He possesses it differently than you and I possess it. Now, what happens in my life is I learn something, I pick it up, I log it away in my brain, I own that information, and then eventually I forget it, right? And I no longer own it. And it is just mind-boggling the things that I hold on to that I store away in that bank of my mind and the things that I cannot seem to hold on to, right? There are things that you hold on to. You remember that song from a spearmint gum commercial from 10 years ago, but you can't remember that you have an appointment on Tuesday. Because we are constantly picking up new information and dropping information. We're learning new things, we're forgetting old things. There's information and knowledge that we possess currently. There's information and knowledge that we'll possess a week from now. But God holds on to wisdom and knowledge differently than we do. You see, God owns wisdom because it always has and always will belong to him. Think about that. God has never learned anything, and God has never forgotten anything. When he possesses wisdom, he possesses it for eternity. Verse 33 speaks of the riches of his wisdom. Verses 34 and 35 speak of the fact that no one has given him the information that he has. Verses 34 and 35 says, who has told God? Who has known his mind? Who has shared wisdom with him? No, he had it already. There is nothing that you can tell God that he says, really? I didn't know that. He knows it already. There is nothing that we can surprise him with. He knows. And this is incredible because that means that God's information is not secondhand. It's always firsthand information. Now, we live in an age where it's incredibly easy to share information. And because it is so easy to share information, we often share information that we don't even really know the credibility of the source of that information. And in case you didn't know, just because you read it on the internet does not make it true. And just because your friend shares it doesn't mean that it's true. But we constantly share things because it looks interesting or it looks funny, but we haven't even read the full article and even know if the person who wrote it is a credible source. We're constantly sharing things that we have bad information on. But God never has to share something that he got bad information from someone. He has no sources for his information. He is the source. He needs no source. God has no degrees on his wall demonstrating the fact that he acquired knowledge and demonstrated wisdom because he has always had it and always will have it. God didn't need to go to school. He didn't need to study. He's always had this information. He's always known it. My brother is pretty sharp. Always has been, especially when it comes to math and physics. When my brother took physics in high school, everyone in the class did really, really poorly on an exam except for my brother. The following week, the students were complaining to the teacher that the exam was too hard. And the teacher said, the reason that you did so badly on the exam is because you did not study. Caleb got an A, and I guarantee it's because he put in the effort to study. Caleb, my brother, how many hours did you study for this exam? And my brother sheepishly said, I kind of forgot about it and didn't study. Now, everybody hated him then, the students and the teacher. But this was just something that he had always been able to grasp. It's an area, a field that he was excellent in. That's how God is in all fields and in all matters. There is nothing that he needs to learn. He knows it already. He knows it all because he is the source of the information to begin with. He knows all because he's the source of all. He knows all because he is the end of all. Verse 36 says this, and think about these words. For of him and through him and to him are all things. Now, that seems like a pretty straightforward phrase. That's powerful. Of him, all things came of him. Through him, all things exist through him. To him, all things are headed to him. If Henry Ford were to come back from the dead, he probably wouldn't be able to fix your 2015 four-door sedan. Even though he was the father of the American automobile, it's changed a lot in the last several decades. It has gone beyond what he knew it to be. He would be unfamiliar with the programming in your car. He would be unfamiliar with your satellite radio. There'd be many pieces of your car that he couldn't even begin to fathom, much less work on, because the technology has advanced beyond him. He may have been the start of it all, but it has gone past him. But God is not only the originator and the facilitator, he is the termination or the end of all things. Piper said, God is the foundation and the destination of all things. And because he is the beginning and end of all things, nothing will go beyond his depth or beyond his comprehension. Nothing will leave him behind. Nothing will outlast him. This means that God is not antiquated or unfashionable or irrelevant. Now think about that. He is not irrelevant even in our day and age. And if the world tarries and he does not return for another 1,000 years or 10,000 years or 1,000,000 years, no matter what progress or digress happens here in our culture, his word, his truth, his wisdom, his knowledge will always be relevant because he is the beginning and the end of all things. God is not surprised at the problems of our age and our culture. God is not confused by the ethical, moral, or political questions of this generation. God is not bewildered by the things that we face in modernity, all right? He is not perplexed by the questions that we have today. And while the questions we face today may be different than the questions from 100 years ago, the answer is still and always will be the truth and wisdom and knowledge of God. Because he is eternal in depth and breadth and yes, even length, and his knowledge and wisdom are too, we will never outrun the jurisdiction of God's knowledge and wisdom. We will never get to the point where God says, you know what? That's outside of my area of expertise. He is an expert in all fields and in all areas, both information and wisdom, both relationships and the emotions of the heart. All areas of life, his wisdom can come to bear upon. You cannot get yourself into a situation, as ridiculous as it might be, you cannot get yourself into a situation where God will say, well, I don't even know what to do with that. He always has an answer. And we think that because our culture's issues and this generation's problems are different from the problems and issues of cultures and generations that came before us, we think that because the problems are different, that the solution must be different, but the solution is the same. God's wisdom and knowledge still remain the answer. Of him and through him, and yes, even to him, are all things. God's wisdom has no expiration date. It never expires. It never gets old. This is illustrated well in the life of Christ. When Jesus preached, people were amazed at the authority of his message. He had preached as someone who knew what he was talking about, and he knew what he was talking about because he had owned it in eternity past. Though he was a 30-year-old man, incredibly young by rabbi standards, he preached to someone who had come to own the information with great experience. Not only did he know the information and preach it with great authority, he preached a message that was counterintuitive, that turned the popular opinions of the day on top of their heads. He wasn't taking the things that everyone held and just repackaging them in a popular way. No, he was telling them something that was absolutely counter to what they thought and believed in the time. He told them, happy are you if you're poor in spirit. Happy are you if you enter into conflict and not win the conflict, but make peace in the conflict. This wasn't common knowledge. It wasn't popular opinion. It flew in the face of what everybody thought in that day. It was seen as irrelevant, but because Jesus spoke it with authority and wisdom and truth, it was life-changing. But there were some people who didn't like what Jesus had to say, and they turned and walked away from him. And Jesus said to the disciples, will you leave me also? And Peter said something powerful. Peter said, Lord, to whom will we go? You have the words of life. Where will we go? You have the words of life. You know, sometimes we don't like what we hear, what we read in the Scripture. Sometimes God's perspective on things is very different from our own. Sometimes God calls us to do things that are difficult. He calls us to do things that are uncomfortable. But what are we going to do? Walk away from the wisdom of God and just take our cousin's word of advice? Just go with what our brother-in-law happens to think? No, he is the final authority. He is the one with all wisdom and all knowledge. And it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. He is the expert in all fields. So we should say with Peter, to whom will we go? To whom will we go? You have the words of life. I'm sure that the people in your life have an interesting perspective on world events. I'm sure they have an interesting perspective on the current questions of morality and ethics and politics. But the only opinion that matters is God's. What Peter had experienced in walking with Jesus is that Jesus just flat out knew what he was talking about. God knows what he's doing. His way just works. And even when I can't begin to imagine how a situation could ever be used for good, God in his knowledge and wisdom knows exactly what he will do to bring good out of a horrible set of circumstances. And this morning, when I think about God who is wise and mighty and powerful, I'm thankful that he is so wise and powerful that he can do good in the midst of a horrible situation. I'm thankful for that this morning. I'm thankful that I don't have to have the answers because he does. You know what being in a relationship with God is like? It's like having the genius in your class as a lab partner. If you had a lab partner in school, you know that there were often assignments that you had to do together. And if you were fortunate, you got teamed up with someone who was absolutely brilliant. And they couldn't do the work for you, but they knew exactly what you needed to do. And when we walk with the Lord, there are things that he will not do for us, but he knows exactly what we should do. Because he not only knows all the information, he always knows what to do. Paul was filled with gratitude because in the midst of a bad situation, God did something incredible. Friends, we can be thankful that even though when we are left to ourselves, we make a mess out of our lives, when we follow God, he can take our mess and turn it into a life that glorifies him. That's what he did in Paul. That's what he did in Peter. That's what he's done in every person's life who's come and said, God, I think you know better than me, and I'm going to follow you. This morning, if you know that God is wise, you know that he has the words of life, and you found them to be true in your own heart and life. You found his wisdom to be valuable in your own experience. Let me encourage you, give thanks to him that he is a wise God. If you're here this morning and you find yourself constantly making foolish and poor choices, you find yourself lost, would you say, like Peter did, God, I recognize you have the words of life, and I'm going to trust and follow you. Doesn't matter how messy your life is. He can take it and make it into a glorified life. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.